mountain man slept with the obese widow. On a bet at auction, snow fell hard in Black Gulch that night, thick flakes drifting down like ash from a dead fire. The wooden platform in the town square creaked under the weight of boots, whiskey, and bad intentions. Lanterns swung in the wind. Men laughed too loud. That kind of laughter usually means someone's about to be hurt. "Widow auction?" the sheriff barked, slamming the gavel down. "Let's keep it moving before the cold kills the mood. I've seen a lot of ugly traditions in frontier towns, but this one always sat wrong with me. When a place starts selling its widows, you already know what kind of souls live there." Sophie Harlan stood on the platform alone, 32 years old, over 300 pounds. Black mourning dress stretched tight, boots soaked through. The men didn't see a woman. They saw winter meat, something to laugh at, bet on, survive off. "Who'll take the cow?" someone yelled. $2 says she breaks the bed," another shouted. Sophie didn't cry. That's what struck me first. Her chin trembled, but her eyes stayed dry. People who've been starving a long time don't waste water. The auctioneer barely looked at her. $2 to start. She cooks, cleans, needs a roof. Then a voice cut through the noise, low, steady. 50. The crowd stalled like a gun misfire. Gabe Ramsey stepped out of the saloon shadows. Big man, mountain, big, the kind built by cold mornings and long silences, fur coat dusted with snow, beard stiff with ice. He wasn't smiling. Someone laughed nervously. "You serious, Bear? You gotta sleep with her tonight. That's the bet." Gabe didn't look at them. He looked at Sophie, just once. Long enough to see her shaking hands, the wig pinned too tight to hide what life had taken. "I said 50, he repeated, tossing the pouch onto the platform. Gold rang loud. That sound changes things. The sheriff swallowed. "Sold." And just like that, the crowd roared. Not joy, hunger, the ugly kind. I remember thinking then, this wasn't about a bet. Not really. Bets are what cowards call it when they want permission to be cruel. Before we rewind and figure out how a mountain man and an auctioned widow ended up here, tell me something. Where are you right now, and what are you doing as you hear this story? Before that night, Black Gulch was already dying. You could feel it in the way men drank before noon and prayed after midnight. Wyoming Territory, 1875. Silvertown passed its peak. The mine still ran, but the luck had moved on. And when luck leaves, bitterness moves in fast. I've passed through places like Black Gulch more times than I care to count. Same layout every time. One main street, one saloon pretending to be a church for sinners, a sheriff who answers to whoever pays him, and people hanging on by their fingernails, telling themselves tomorrow will be better. Sophie Harlan wasn't born a widow. She came here young, married a miner with strong arms and bad lungs. For a few years, they scraped by. Then the mine collapsed. The company paid nothing. The town shrugged. That's how it works. Men die. Widows stay behind. She took in laundry, cooked for crews, ate what was left after everyone else finished. Illness followed hunger, and hunger followed grief. Weight came on slow, and then all at once, like snow on a weak roof. People stopped calling her Sophie. They started calling her the obese widow, as if that explained everything. The wig mattered more than most folks realized. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. Her real hair had thinned after the fever, and the winter she nearly starved. The wig let her pass as someone she used to be. In a town like this, memory is sometimes the only shelter you have. Then there was Gabe Ramsey. Gabe didn't belong to Black Gulch, and the town never forgave him for that. He lived up in the Bighorns, miles from anyone, trapping, hunting, trading pelts once or twice a season. He came down for ammunition, salt, coffee, never stayed long, never played cards, never drank past one glass. Men like Gabe scare towns like this, not because they're violent, but because they don't need anyone. Independence looks like judgment to people who sold their souls cheap. He'd been married once, lost her to fever years back, no children. After that, he went higher into the mountains, where grief doesn't echo so loud. I've known men like him. They don't talk about loss. They carry it in their shoulders, in the way they stand like they're always bracing for weather. The auction wasn't official law, just a tradition, a filthy one. When winter came hard, widows without family were matched to men who'd feed them. On paper, it sounded practical. In truth, it was humiliation dressed up as mercy. The sheriff, Tate, called it charity. The gamblers called it sport. The ranchers called it cheap labor. Nobody called it what it was. That night, Clay Mercer ran the bets. Clay always did. Thin smile, clean hands, never lifted a shovel in his life. He saw Sophie as a joke and Gabe as entertainment. I've learned something over the years. Towns don't turn cruel all at once. They do it inch by inch, until nobody remembers when it crossed the line. When Gabe threw that gold on the platform, Black Gulch didn't just sell a widow. It sold the last excuse it had for pretending it was decent. And Sophie? She didn't know yet that the man who bought her wasn't there to own anything. She only knew the crowd was laughing, the snow was falling, and her life had just changed hands. I've seen fear like that before. Quiet, heavy, the kind that sinks instead of screaming. Pain doesn't announce itself when it comes back. It waits until you're tired, or quiet, or alone with a fire that's burned too low. That night in the cabin, with the wind pressing against the logs, both of them were running out of places to hide. Gabe poured a little whiskey into a tin cup, didn't drink it right away, just held it. His hand shook, barely, the way hands do when they remember something the mind pretends is finished. He hadn't planned on staying sober that night, but seeing Sophie again had knocked the breath out of him in a way no fight ever had. Years earlier, down near Fort Laramie, he'd been younger and softer around the eyes. He'd danced once, awkwardly, with a girl who laughed like she didn't yet know how cruel the world could be. Sophie Langston. He'd promised nothing, but he'd hoped plenty. Then he'd gone north on a long trap line, and when he came back, she was married and gone. He told himself that was life. He told himself to forget. Men are good at telling themselves that. After his wife died of fever, Gabe stopped believing in second chances. He didn't rage. He didn't drink himself stupid. He just left. Higher ground. Fewer people. Fewer reminders. The mountains don't care what you've lost. That's why some of us choose them. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, the wig folded in her hands like something fragile and ashamed. She hadn't planned on taking it off in front of anyone. It had always been the last line between her and the way people looked at her. Without it, she felt exposed in a way clothes couldn't fix. Her marriage hadn't been the safety she'd imagined. Her husband had been kind at first, then bitter, then tired. The mind took his strength before it took his life, and when he couldn't work anymore, the town stopped seeing him, too. By the time he died, Sophie had already learned what it meant to disappear while still breathing. She spoke slowly, like each word cost something. about the nights she'd eaten flour boiled in water, about the sickness that followed, about waking up one morning and realizing her hair was coming out in her hands, about the looks that changed, one by one, until no one looked at her at all except to mock. I've heard confessions like that before, not in churches, in kitchens, in barns, in places where people finally feel unseen enough to tell the truth. Her fear wasn't just the town. It was the idea that even Gabe, seeing her fully, might turn away. That was the wound that never closed. Not hunger, not cold. Being unwanted long enough that you start to believe it's permanent. Gabe listened without interrupting. That mattered more than any promise he could have made. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, not from anger, but from holding too much in for too long. He told her about his wife, about watching the fever take her breath while he held her hand and couldn't do a damn thing, about the mornings afterward when he'd still set out 2 cups before remembering there was only one of him left, about choosing the mountains because they didn't ask questions. He admitted something else, too, quieter. That part of him had come to the auction ready to lose that bet, that he'd expected humiliation, maybe even deserved it, because men like him sometimes believe suffering is the only honest currency left. When he said her name again, just Sophie, she looked up like she'd been waiting years to hear it spoken without cruelty attached. Their goals weren't heroic. They weren't grand. Gabe wanted quiet that didn't feel empty. Sophie wanted a life where she wasn't traded, judged, or laughed at. Both wanted something dangerously simple, to be chosen without condition. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, 2 people sat with their pasts laid bare, unsure if that honesty would save them or ruin them. I'll say this much. From a lifetime of watching people run from ghosts, the bravest thing either of them did wasn't showing up to that auction. It was staying in that room once the truth came out. Peace never lasts long in places built on cruelty. It always sends someone to test it. Morning came thin and gray over the bighorns. Smoke lifted from Gabe's chimney, a small, stubborn line against the sky. Sophie stood at the doorway, wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching the mountains like they might say something back. She hadn't slept much. Neither had Gabe. Some truths don't let you rest once they're spoken. That was when the horse showed up, old bay gelding, blown hard, foam on its bit, and behind it, a man who didn't belong in the high country. Neat coat, city boots already scuffed, Marshal Elias Crow. I've met men like Crow before. They smile the way lawyers do when they already know how the story ends. He'd been sent up from town with a warrant folded clean in his pocket and a head full of assumptions. Crow dismounted slow, hands away from his gun, but not far. His eyes flicked to Sophie, then back to Gabe, measuring distance, weight, consequence. "Ramsey," he said. No greeting, just a name, like a hook. Gabe didn't invite him in. That mattered. He stood in the doorway, blocking the cabin without making a show of it, the way men do when they've decided there's a line. "You bought a woman at auction," Crow went on. "Town's got questions. Sheriff's got pressure. Clay Mercer's making noise." Of course he was. Men like Clay can't stand losing control of a joke. Sophie stiffened. I could see it in my mind clear as day. That old fear crawling back. The sense that she was about to be handed over again, this time with paperwork attached. Crow noticed it too. He always would have. "Ma'am," he said softer now, "I'm here to make sure nobody's been wronged." That lie landed heavy. I've heard it spoken with clean hands and dirty intentions more times than I can count. Gabe answered before Sophie could. "She wasn't bought," he said. "She was taken out of a pit." Crow raised an eyebrow. "That's not how the town sees it." "Town's wrong," Gabe replied. Silence stretched. Wind rattled the eaves. Crow studied Gabe's hands, those big scarred things that looked capable of breaking a man in half. Then he studied Sophie again, longer this time, not with hunger or mockery, but calculation. "You know what happens next," Crow said. "Sheriff can claim coercion. Auction records say payment. Clay says there was a bet. If this turns ugly, it won't stay in Black Gulch." There it was, the offer hidden inside the threat. Crow leaned in just enough. "I can lose the paperwork. Say I found nothing worth chasing. But you leave, both of you, and you don't come back." Sophie looked at Gabe, not pleading, just asking. That was new for her, and it meant everything. Gabe didn't answer right away. He looked past Crow, out at the trees, at the life he'd built to avoid men exactly like this. I recognized that look. The one where a man weighs solitude against justice and realizes he can't have both. He finally spoke. "What's the price?" Crow's mouth twitched. "Stay quiet. Stay gone. And don't make Black Gulch look at itself. I'll say this, and then I'll step back. Deals like that are how the West kept breathing. Not clean, not fair, just survivable." The question was whether Gabe and Sophie were willing to pay it. They left before dawn, not because Crow told them to hurry, not because Black Gulch deserved mercy. They left because waiting is how people get caught. I've learned that the hard way. When trouble gives you a window, you crawl through it, even if the glass cuts your back. Gabe packed light. Ammunition counted twice. Traps left hanging. The cabin stood quiet behind them, door closed, but not locked. He didn't look back. Men who look back don't get far. Sophie rode behind him on the big mule, arms wrapped around his coat. Snow came down soft at first, then harder, needling their faces as they pushed east toward the timberline. The mountains didn't care about bets or auctions. They only cared whether you kept moving. By midday, the first test came. A narrow pass choked with deadfall, perfect ground for an ambush. Gabe slowed the mule without a word. His shoulders tightened. Sophie felt it before she saw it. That kind of fear has weight. 3 men stepped out from the trees, not miners, not hunters. Railroad guards by the look of them, clean rifles, hard eyes. The lead man smiled. "Ramsey," he said, "word travels." Of course it does. Money carries faster than truth. They wanted the gold Gabe had won from Clay, and Sophie too, though they didn't say it outright. They never do. One hand drifted toward a rifle sling. Gabe answered by shifting his stance just enough to shield Sophie without drawing steel. I've watched moments like this stretch until they break. This one snapped fast. The first shot cracked and tore bark off a pine. Gabe fired back without thinking, the recoil shuddering through his arm. One man went down, screaming. Another bolted. The third stood frozen, staring at the woman on the mule, at her size, her stillness, her eyes locked on him without fear. Sophie surprised herself then. She reached down, grabbed the fallen rifle from the snow, and leveled it the way she'd seen Gabe do it once by the fire. "Leave," she said. Her voice didn't shake. The man left. They didn't talk for a long while after that. Blood leaves a smell, even when it's not yours. Gabe reloaded with hands that trembled just enough to notice. Sophie handed the rifle back when her arms began to ache. That was the first thing the road took from them. Illusion. The idea that leaving meant peace. The second trial came 2 nights later. They'd taken shelter in a burned-out homestead, walls half fallen, roof gone. Snow drifted through the rooms like ghosts. Gabe woke to the sound of hooves. Too many. Clay Mercer's men. He recognized them by their laughter. They'd followed the trail, sloppy, loud, confident. Men who thought brute force counted as planning. Gabe whispered for Sophie to stay low. He slipped out the back, circled wide, breath slow despite the pounding in his chest. Every step brought back the old memory. Another night, another woman he couldn't save. His fingers shook on the trigger. I'll pause here for a moment, because this is where men break. When the past reaches up and grabs your ankle just as you try to move forward. The shooting was fast and ugly. No heroics, no speeches, just muzzle flashes and pain. Gabe took a round through the shoulder, spun hard into the snow. Clay's men scattered when they realized the mountain man didn't fight fair. Sophie dragged him inside, not graceful, not gentle, desperate. She tore cloth, packed snow, pressed until the bleeding slowed. Her hands were steady now. Funny how fear teaches you what matters. "Don't you die," she said, not as a plea, as an order. Gabe laughed once, weak. Wasn't planning on it. The third trial wasn't men at all. It was the storm. Whiteout, wind screaming like something alive. They lost the trail, then the ridge, then any sense of direction. Gabe's shoulder burned. Sophie's legs shook with every step. The mule went down and didn't get back up. They huddled beneath a rock shelf while the world tried to erase them. Sophie pressed against Gabe, all that warmth she'd been taught to hate, keeping him alive through the night. He realized it sometime before dawn, half delirious. "I'd be dead without you," he muttered. She didn't answer. She was asleep, head on his chest, breathing slow and sure. When the storm broke, so did something else. They reached a trading post near the Platte, thinking themselves safe. They weren't. Marshal Crow was there, sitting by the fire, papers on the table, a look on his face like regret or something close enough to fake it. "I tried," he said. "Sheriff pushed harder than I expected. Clay paid louder." Gabe reached for his gun. Crow didn't flinch. "Won't help," Crow said. "Warrant's federal now. Kidnapping, fraud, assault." Sophie stood. Between them, again. "I chose to go," she said. "I'll say it in court." Crow shook his head. "Court won't hear it. Not from a woman they already sold once." That landed deep. I've seen truths die faster than lies when the wrong ears hear them. Crow leaned back. "There is one way out. Train leaves at sundown, west. No names, no records. You vanish." Gabe looked at Sophie. The road had taken blood, warmth, certainty. Now it asked for identity. Sometimes survival costs more than death. They had hours to decide. "And I'll leave you here for a breath." They didn't run right away. People always think the choice is made in a flash. It isn't. The real damage happens in the quiet after the offer, when you sit with it and feel what it costs. They holed up outside the trading post in a low stand of cottonwoods by the river. Gabe cleaned his wound in silence. Sophie watched the water slide past, dark and fast. The train whistle echoed somewhere far off, like a warning given too early. I've noticed this about crossroads in life. The road you don't take starts accusing you before you even choose. Sophie broke first. "Crow said court won't hear me." Gabe nodded. He didn't trust his voice. "I've been sold once already," she went on. "Auction block, laughter, men deciding my worth with coins in their hands." She swallowed. "If we run, I live. If we stay, They'll make me a story they like better." That's when Gabe finally looked at her, and here's where the knife turns. He told her the truth he'd never said out loud, not to Crow, not to the mountains, not even to himself. 7 years ago, he said, staring at the dirt, when you said you were engaged, I didn't leave because I understood. I left because I was a coward. Her breath caught. I heard later your husband drank, hit you. I came back once, stood outside your house, heard shouting. I walked away. His hand curled, fingers shaking. That night, I promised myself I'd never be too late again, and here we are. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Not angry, worse, honest. Sophie didn't cry. That surprised him. I wondered, she said softly, for years, why you never came. She turned to him then, eyes steady. But if you stay now because of guilt, I don't want it. That landed harder than any accusation. Gabe stood, paced, stopped. His body wanted motion. His mind wanted escape. Everything in him screamed to put Sophie on that train and vanish into snow and anonymity. Survival, simple, clean. But something else rose up, something stubborn. I've seen men reach this point before, the moment when running stops being fear and starts being betrayal of the one thing you finally got right. They won't stop, he said. Clay won't. Sheriff Tate won't. I know, Sophie said. That's why I'm staying. He stared at her. Staying means a rope or a cell. Staying means they don't get to decide my story again, she replied. I've been quiet long enough. The twist wasn't Crow. It wasn't the warrant. It was this. Sophie wasn't the one being saved anymore. She was choosing. Gabe sank back down, elbows on knees. His chest felt hollow. All my life, he said, I've survived by leaving towns, leaving graves, leaving promises. He looked up at her. If I leave now, I'll live, but I'll die inside the same way. Sophie knelt in front of him, large hands warm around his injured shoulder. Then don't run from this one. The train whistle blew again, louder, closer. Gabe stood, decision settling like iron in his bones. We go back, he said, not to beg, not to hide. We go back and finish it. Sophie nodded once. No relief, just resolve. That's the thing about real turning points. They don't feel triumphant. They feel heavy, like you just agreed to carry something for the rest of your life. High noon has a sound to it. It isn't loud. It's the absence of noise. The way even drunks stop laughing when the sun sits straight overhead and shadows crawl under boots like they're trying to hide. Black Gulch waited. The street lay open from the saloon to the sheriff's office, dust packed hard by years of wagons and regret. Curtains twitched. A child was pulled indoors. Someone shut a piano lid mid-note. I've stood in places like this. You feel smaller than the sky and heavier than your sins at the same time. Gabe and Sophie walked in from the north end of town. No horse, no hurry. Gabe's coat hung open. You could see the bandage darkening under his sleeve. His right hand stayed loose near his hip. Not eager, not afraid. Sophie walked beside him, chin level, wig folded and tucked under her arm like a surrendered flag she no longer needed. Clay was already there, leaning against a post, smiling like he'd rehearsed this moment. Sheriff Tate stood near the gallows frame, thumbs hooked in his belt, law and rope sharing the same shadow. Well, Clay drawled, the bear came back and brought the auction piece. A few men laughed, not many. Sophie stepped forward before Gabe could speak. That mattered. I was sold here, she said, voice carrying clean and steady. Bought for a joke. Forced, because I was hungry and alone. She looked at Tate. You called it legal. Tate shrugged. Auction was voluntary. Sophie nodded slowly. So is telling the truth. She raised her chin, bald patches and thinning hair catching the sun. A ripple ran through the crowd. People shifted. Some looked away. I wore the wig so you'd listen, she went on. Now I don't care if you don't. I've seen shame move through a crowd like a bad wind. It never hits everyone, just enough. Clay scoffed. Touching speech still doesn't change the bet. Or the debt. That's where you're wrong, Gabe said quietly. He stepped forward, boots crunching once, then stopping. The bet was between you and me, and I paid it. His eyes never left Clay's. But the auction broke territorial law. Witnesses saw you force the bid when no one else would touch it. Crow stepped out of the crowd then, ledger in hand, voice thin but firm. He's right. I wrote it down, along with Tate's cut. The street went still. Tate's hand drifted toward his gun. Gabe noticed. Everyone did. Time stretched. Dust drifted. Somewhere a crow cawed, loud and stupid. I always hated this part, the waiting, where every man finds out who he really is before he moves. Sheriff, Gabe said, don't. Tate drew anyway. The shot came fast. One crack. Gabe moved once. Clay screamed and dropped, clutching his leg. Tate's gun skidded across the dirt, kicked away by someone braver than they thought they were. No second shot. Gabe stood there, arms smoking, breathing hard. He hadn't aimed to kill. That told the crowd everything. Silence held, then murmurs, then anger, scattered and unsure. Tate sank to his knees as two men grabbed him. Clay was still screaming, more from shock than pain. Sophie crossed the street and stood beside Gabe. She took his hand, didn't look at the blood. Is it over? She asked. For today, Gabe said. The gallows creaked in the breeze. No one used it, not then. They walked out the same way they'd come in. No cheers, no chase. Just space opening where fear had been. That's how most reckonings end, not with applause, with people deciding not to be monsters today. When the gun smoke cleared, Black Gulch didn't cheer. Towns like that never do. They just exhale and pretend they were never holding their breath. Sheriff Tate was gone by nightfall, hauled east in irons by men who'd once laughed at his jokes. Clay lived. A limp stayed with him, the kind that talks every time it rains. He stopped gambling after that. Pain has a way of curing arrogance when sermons fail. The widow auction never happened again. No proclamation, no apology. Just silence where it used to be. Gabe and Sophie didn't stay to enjoy any of it. People always expect gratitude after a stand like that. The West doesn't work that way. Gratitude turns sour fast when it reminds folks of what they allowed. They left at dawn. 2 horses this time, 1 wagon, tracks heading north, swallowed by frost before noon. By winter's end, word drifted back that a cabin in the Bighorns had smoke rising every morning, that Sophie was eating well, that her hair was growing back, thin but stubborn, that Gabe's shoulder never healed right, and he didn't complain. I've noticed something about survival. It rarely looks like triumph. More often, it looks like choosing not to bleed where everyone can see it. The street in Black Gulch went back to dust. The gallows stood empty. The piano in the saloon stayed out of tune. Some endings don't echo. They just settle. I've told this story a few times now, and it still sits heavy in my chest. Not because of the gunfight, not because of the auction, but because Sophie survived something worse than hunger or winter. She survived being laughed at when she needed mercy. And Gabe, He didn't save her by being a hero. He just refused to play along when cruelty asked him to smile. Out here, dignity isn't something the world hands you. It's something you carry away quietly, even if it costs you a home, a shoulder that never heals, or a town you'll never return to. Now I'll ask you the same thing I ask every night when the fire burns low. Where are you right now, and what are you doing as you hear the end of this story? Tell me below.